Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we talk to Santiago Calatrava, who is an architect. He's a structural engineer, a sculptor, a painter. So he's many, many things. But then what is interesting is that he changed completely some things in architecture. He merged advanced engineering solutions with dramatic visual statements. And I would like to know how all this happened. And let's start from the beginning. You are from Valencia and you decided to become an architect. And later you went to Zurich to attend engineering school. You had the need to become an engineer. So can you explain a little bit this, please?
Well, the reality of my career has been very much propitiated through the different circumstances. On the one side, I grew in Valencia and I could attend an art school when I was very young. I was eventually just by case because we was related to the director of the art school, and I could go there when I was 8 and 9 years old. Then when I was 16, I finished college and I wanted to enter in the School of Beaux-Arts in Paris, but this was 68. And I went indeed to Paris, but I saw that the school was not operating. So I came back to Valencia, entered in the local art school, but also in the Polytechnic. And slowly, I was more involved in the studies of architecture. And indeed, after 6 years, I was an architect and also a urban planner, but in an age to do the military service in Spain. I was not willing to do that because we was living in a dictatorial system. And in the meantime, I have been many times during the summer vacation, visiting European countries, in particular Switzerland. And I was convinced that the school here was good for me, and I entered in the Polytechnic. But it was, like I say, it was almost a series of circumstances who brought me from the will to enter in an art school to enter in a Polytechnic and study engineering, seeking also a little bit for more exact science, mathematics, mechanics, and that. This was also is a little bit the result of the circumstances, if you want, and the will to extend my studies and bring them so far I could.
But why did you become an engineer and an architect and you didn't decide to be completely an artist? For instance, you are a sculptor somehow, and some of your sculptures have been, for instance, exposed in Park Avenue, New York, and so on and so forth. But why didn't you decide to be a full artist?
See, it was, I think your question makes a lot of sense because it was a kind of conversion. You understand? I was in Paris in the whole summer of 68, and I was working in a non-profit organization, attending, doing a little bit social services during a couple of hours a day, and then enjoying Paris. And one of the things who happens, it is that in one of the breaks, close to Notre-Dame, the place where I was working was close to Notre-Dame, I entered. It was at 11 o'clock through the transept into Notre-Dame. And, the light was coming in with such an enormous force through south transept, and all these colors and all the beauty of this place opened my eyes that architecture is an art, that no painting has delivered me or no sculpture has delivered me the sensation of space and in gravity and in materiality as there. And I was doing that almost every day because I was working in La Rue Chanoinesse, who was just around the corner. And this opened my mind towards architecture. I discovered that architecture is an art, as painting and as sculpting. Eventually, you see an art who is very much bounded to a lot of exact knowledge, as it is technology or material properties, and the exactitude of the drawings, and the static and the stability, who in a cathedral is really almost an omega. All those signs are there in such a place. And I was conscious that entering into a school of architecture, I was confronted to a long way. And indeed, if I continued working in engineering, was also a way, you see, to gain more certitude about structural behavior, material behavior, and also the world of mathematics and mechanics that even until today I love, and I think is really a kind of philosophy.
I mean, Switzerland is important because, if I am not wrong, one of your masters was the Swiss engineer Robert Maillard. He was influencing you at the beginning, no?
Yes.
Robert Maillard.
Yes.
Maillard.
You see, yes. Also, it's interesting that you speak about Robert Maillard. Robert Maillard, born in Geneva, son of a Belgian diplomat and a Swiss mother, grew in Switzerland and studied also at ETH, at the ETH, the Federal Polytechnic. Indeed, what you discover in his work is, at the one side, an enormous exactitude and devotion, for the exactitude of those polygonal of forces and all the curves generated from out of the static, but also an enormous sensibility towards the landscape. And even the most insignificant of his bridges has something charming and something delicate in itself. Of course, some of them are real heroic gestures, in the middle of the mountain, the Swiss mountain, and eventually only to let the cows pass through. But they are from a beauty, the conjunction, landscape and form, you see, in the most economic way, you see, but in the bridges in the curve, the Tabanasa, Salgina Tobel. And so, of course, you see, I knew about Maillard before I entered at the Polytechnic, as much as I knew that Albert Einstein was also a pupil of the Swiss Federal Polytechnic. It was, for me, let's say, it was quite a logic step, even if when I came here, I didn't speak a single word in German.
Yeah, tell me something. You decide to be an architect, right? And many architects start by doing buildings or houses. But in your destiny, and if one follows your work is mainly bridges, railroad stations, museums. Why did you start, for instance, or at the very early beginning, you worked doing the Zurich station, for instance, or then you did a bridge in Barcelona, then the Lusitania Bridge in Merida. Then you did the bridge of the Expo in Seville. And there are plenty. Punta del Alamillo Bridge in Seville, and so on and so forth. And then you worked on the Zurich station. You worked in Lisbon. You worked in Lyon, Reggio Emilia, and so on and so forth. Why this thing of stations and bridges? Were you inspired by that? Or?
Yes, as somebody says, we are the product of our will and the circumstances also. The circumstances, in my case, plays a very important role. Being a student here, I met a young Swiss woman who became my wife, as still my wife. She was a law student, and we married as a student. Once I had done the PhD here at the ETH, I decided to start it by myself here in Switzerland. Since I didn't have had any connection or any knowledge about people who could maybe commission me a house or commission me, I do not know, condominiums or something like that, I has had to go back into the most arid and lapidar way to get jobs is making competition. And the only one who does competitions mostly is the public hand. So I started competing, you see, for eventually a railway station here in Zurich, and I was lucky to win the competition together with a colleague. And this was my first station. Once you enter in this domain of the railway station, of course, it's quite a long process. You see, although they are buildings who eventually they take 12 to 20 years to be concluded because they are long processes, but you learn also a lot about what is about doing that. The same thing happened with bridges. Bridges mostly only very rarely a private promotes a bridge. And so once you do also a bridge and you do it, let's say, properly, then eventually you will also get engaged through competitions into other bridges. Lusitania was a competition and many others. All the railway station has been coming out of competition. The interest of the public work is, first of all, that permits you, even if mostly you are in a very constrained field, and apparently the freedom is very restricted when you are doing a station, because the tracks are there. There are so many things that you have to take in account. But still, if you look back to all the stations I have done, they are all different, one from the other, because they are adapted to the local circumstances. And so still, there is also in this minimal exercise of freedom, there is also a variety. The same thing happens with bridges. Although the statical systems to solve bridges are very limited, or they are a beam, or they are an arc, or they are a cable stair bridge, or they are a suspension bridge. There are few models of bridges. But then the variety through the circumstances, the span, the landscape, permits you to let also a certain freedom. And I enjoy very much doing it. Yes.
It's interesting because nothing to do with you. You were going out of Spain because you didn't like the fascist regime. But it's strange that in Italy, for instance, during the fascist regime, they built many, many railroad stations. I mean, there was a famous architect called Piacentini who did plenty of the station in Rome, a new station. And the stations are landmarks in a city, right? They're not only useful for travelers and for the trains, obviously, but they are architectural landmarks. And more than stations, the bridges. Bridges are symbols of cities. There are very, very well-known bridges all over the world, and yours in particular, who have this very specific shapes that are like birds. Or how do you conceive these stations and the bridges?
You touch a very important point. You see the significance of public works. You see, public works are, as the name says, devoted to public. And you see, particularly in the case of the bridges, happens that you could imagine Europe 1945. After the war, you see, the major part of the bridges in Central Europe was destroyed because it's logic. You see that because the war. So they started rebuilding them in a quick manner. Also then later in the 50s, through the need of creating housing and creating many other things, it developed also this kind of doctrine called pure functionalism. You understand? Or out of the rationalism, the pure functionalism. So the bridges who merged in the 60s, even the railway stations who merged in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, they do not have anything to do with this what bridges was before and what the station was before. If you look, for example, Victoria Station or St. Pancras or whatever, the extraordinary stations or Grand Central in New York, or this it was Penn Station in New York, for example, nothing to do with the many other stations who has been built wherever, you see, in the previous period to the 80s or 90s where I started working. Also in bridges, they appear this kind of pure functional bridge in which the best bridge was the cheapest one that could link from one corner to another. Nothing to do with the Tower Bridge in London or whatever a bridge in Paris, le Pont Neuf, le Pont du Louvre, Alexandre Troyes, who makes this city indeed. You see, those bridges are the face of this city because they are also built in open spaces. They are built along or over the river, who has been the reason why the city is there. And so I discovered a field in which, without staying in the limits of the pure material use, but I started, for example, using steel, who was very uncommon at the time. The major part of the bridges was done in concrete. Or I started also combining concrete and steel. Also making clear statical systems. The Alamillo Bridge with the gravity of the pylon, the Lusitania Bridge in Merida with the big arc in the center, also the bridge in Barcelona with double arcs, one of them inclined. The proposition of also changing and making variants to the arc, who usually are vertical, inclining them as a counterweight to the deck, making also asymmetric bridge in relation to the place and relation to the city. And the same thing happens in the station. The station, the most important thing who permits a station is to create beautiful and large public spaces. I have been practicing that until today. At the one side, if you take the most fantastic cultural buildings of our time, let's say Le Louvre, or Metropolitan Museum, British Museum, the National Gallery in London, extraordinary collections of art. They get eventually 10 million people as visitors a year, 12 million if they are very big. If you go 3 or 4 million, you are in the range of the biggest museums in the world. I mean, a station can easily get 200,000 persons, 300,000 a day. It means after 3 days, you get already 1 million. In 1 year, you maybe get 100 million visitors. And they are the major part of it. They are people who are going to work, coming to work. They are people who are going and coming to the same place day by day. Whatever beautiful you do there is an homage to them. And also, sadly, you see, many of those people, they will not go to the idea, or they do not have the possibility visiting Le Louvre, the British Museum, or whatever, you understand? And this is indeed a good place to do an effort inside the limits of the economical possibilities your client is giving you to do something special.
It's strange because bridges, as you said, are very symbolic. You mentioned a few, the Paris and London, the Golden Gate in San Francisco, the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, and so on. So there are many others. The bridges sometimes have problems. There have been terrible accidents, bridges that fell because they were not built in the proper way. So I guess that to build a bridge is also a great technical and importance for the safety. So you have to combine the engineering, the safety, the technical with the beauty, which is not always very easy, I imagine.
You see, I would like to say that in general, the constructions, they are, from the statistical point of view, 99.9% of them, they are properly done. The case that we know certain accidents in bridges like the Tacoma Narrows or the bridge in Canada, you see, who also falls apart in one case, because dynamic effects of the wind, and in the second case, because the buckling of certain members was not proper studied at the time, also show us that it is sometimes necessary, to through certain failures to learn out of it. And this is the way how engineering has been done until the NASA was able, to send rockets, to the space, and satellites in the space was necessary. Also some failures, the same thing in the aviation. And this shows also that very often the technical part of the engineering is really in the limit of the possible. And it is necessary to be very prudent, because I believe that to be prudent and to do daring and audacious things are two different things. You can be extremely prudent, but you can be also at the other side and take a very conscious, about this, what you are doing. But at the other side, you can also think, in a daring way. That is, in my opinion, one of the beautiful parts of the engineering. So happens, for example, in many of the constructions of my art. You see the bridges who are even medium span or even little span, but they look so audacious. They look so elegant. They look so in gravity. It's a fight against gravity. And these things are part of the beautiful design, are products of the engineering mind. And they are all creatures of the mind of an engineer.
Then in your career, around the 90s, you add a new thing to your work, which was the movable aspects. And in the Kuwait Pavilion, in the Milwaukee Art Museum, which is more or less made like wings of a bird, in the World Trade Center in New York. I mean, what is this movable aspect that you added, and why? What's the point of that? Why do you do that? Why did you change?
I believe that often art precedes science. Art precedes science. For example, when the Impressionists, from Sisley to Monet, and all of those, they was painting, and dealing with light, and dealing with colors, and the palette chosen in a way, that it is related to the natural light. And then the impressions of the light in the objects who brought us to the Impressionism, they precede the PhD thesis of Albert Einstein, who brought him to the Nobel Prize later, who about the nature of the light and the energy and the photons and all generate then later on the quantum mechanics and all of that. So often art precedes science. You see, the idea of the movement and the dynamic is already, for example, in the futurist movement in Italy, Umberto Boccioni and others, they has had it. And you see Alexander Calder, the great American sculptor.
Yes, of course.
And all these mobiles and all of that. So in a way, the idea of introducing elements, you see, who through the natural forces or mechanical forces, they can change shape, is something who pre-exists. Myself, you see, and in all modesty, I have done a PhD about topography and about folding polyedra from a polyedra into a plane and from one plane into a line, or even polyedra very complex, spherical one, bringing them into a line. This was the subject. So transformations, you see, of shapes from a three-dimensional into a one-dimensional line. See, I have had to put it in this frame, in order to make it scientifically correct and present it at the ATH here in Zurich as a PhD. But you see, at the other side, all these transformations and all those things are generating shapes and are generating forms. And I thought that even out of the fact that force, you see, as a formula, is equal to mass, which is a universal constant, multiplied by acceleration, and acceleration is already a dynamic factor. So I thought, you see, there is possible, in my opinion, out of the forces, out of the shapes, to make them transformable. Transformable to adapt them eventually to the sun, to the shadows. You see, transformable also to show that a building is not something static and rigid who change only through the shadows when the sun is turning around it, but also it can change like a flower, let's say, you see. And indeed, you see, at the head of my PhD thesis is written Natura, Mater et Magistra, who means nature, mother, and teacher. And you see, because this what I was dreaming, is done every day, you see, by flowers, who open during the day when the sun is there, a sunflower, or they turn following the sun, or even by leaves, by branches, by our own body, you see, when we are opening our hands, opening our arms, and all of that. I think there is a whole poetic. A whole poet is an universum of poetic, you see, who gets open in the moment in which you introduce dynamic or a dynamical shapes in architecture, who already exist because doors open and close, windows open and close, and many things. The stores in a building, they can be retracted or extended and change so the shape. So these things are very regular in our architecture. And indeed, the first time I have done in a building something movable, there was gates. It was in a warehouse somewhere in northern Germany, and the client permit us to do doors to open and change shape. And it was very well received by the critic at the time, and still they are working every day.
You are basically yourself a sculptor, but you are using the concept. You talked before about Calder, about others. I know you have been inspired also by Auguste Rodin or by Frank Stella and so on and so forth. But for instance, in one building that you did, which is a real building, you did it in Malmo, the spinal column, with an allusion to a bird. But this is a really sculpturesque building, right? So how do you combine this aesthetic vision of yours, which is art, with security, functionality, and all these things which are absolutely necessary in architecture? Because a building has to be nice to look at from the inside and the outside, but it has to function like a human body or like a car or something. Everything has to function.
Yes, you spoke about Calder, also Rodin, Auguste Rodin. I want to speak about another sculptor from which I have a lot of respect, is Henry Moore. Henry Moore, I got once a small booklet edited by the Henry Moore Foundation, who was a compendium of notes he dictated about the sculpture. I bought it in French. It was a notice or notes over the sculpture. And then there was a passage in which he was comparing a sculpture to architecture. And I thought, my goodness, is that fantastic? You see, he was saying that although the sculptor, works with material and has the freedom to express himself, and he is only bounded to the nature of the material he is working. If he is carving stone or sculpting in stone, or he is working with wood, or he is working with metal, or whatever, is the laws of the material who make the boundaries and the limit of his work. Otherwise, he is free. Then he says an architect, differently from the sculptor, is bounded also to the laws of the utility, the use of the building, isn't it? And these are very severe limitations. But then he said, in what point the architecture is superior to the sculpture? It is in the human scale, because you can penetrate and it can wrap you. It's like entering in a cathedral thing, the sensation of walking in, you understand? And this whole event, of mass, of pillars, of stone, arcs, and all of that, who is surrounding you and conditioning your immediate environment. And then he said there, is in the scale, in the human scale, where the architecture is superior to the sculpture. And indeed, even Rodin writes with an enormous respect about architecture. Rodin, who was a self-made man, he didn't went into an art school. He went into an arts and crafts school and worked as a practitioner from Carrière Belleuse in Belgium. But coming from Brussels to Paris by walk, he went and visited Amiens, Reims, and visit all those cathedrals, and has done a series of notes, about the cathedral. And then he speaks about the architecture as the harmonious game of volumes and planes and volumes in the light. Later on, an architect, Le Corbusier, copied this definition and wrote it in Cahiers d'Art, and he wrote saying the architecture is the harmonious games of volume under the light. Pick up of an sculpture. It was Rodin who defined.
But
and this is very interesting to see the last generation of great sculptors: Henry Moore, Eduardo Chillida, Dubuffet, Calder. They have done bigger and bigger and bigger sculptures where you almost can penetrate.
Yeah, but they don't have the utility that an architecture has. Of course, I guess that a person who lives in a building of yours or who prays, like you recently have rebuilt the Orthodox Cathedral in New York City, or people who arrive in a station built by you, of course, they have an aesthetic pleasure or an aesthetic feeling that it's not just done like this, but it's done by a great artist. But in the same time, it has to function. And I am a writer of novels, and also in a novel, if the novel is not clear and made properly, readers will not read it. It's not just a question of words and talent and imagination. It's also a question of making the sentences clear, making sense so that the reader understands. So in a sculpture, there's not much responsibility. In a very tall building or in a bridge or in a station where, as you said, gather millions of people, the architect has a very important responsibility. No? I mean, it's a double feature. In one way, they're not useful because they're tombs, but we still look at the pyramids of Egypt or to old buildings, in Rome or whatever. So the aesthetic side is very important, but also the function. This is what I read in your work. I mean, that you were able, and not many architects do this, to combine style and talent with the necessities. And that's why probably architecture is very important, because it's part of life. Art is probably also important, very important, but it has a different use.
I'm just trying to follow and also get input out of your own words. You say you write novels. I want to speak about a novel who has saved architecture. You see, and this is the novel of Notre-Dame de Paris, written by Victor Hugo. The reason why Victor Hugo wrote this novel was because Notre-Dame at the time, after the French Revolution and the subsequent small revolutions in Paris, Notre-Dame was in danger to be demolished and was also physically in a very bad shape because nobody was paying anything to restore Notre-Dame. By writing this fantastic book and writing inside, ceci tuera cela, this we call that, you see, which it is a chapter. It is one of the most beautiful chapters, a moving chapter written in literature over architecture. And then he saved effectively Notre-Dame. Consequence of it, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc became, from the emperor at the time, became the commission, I think Napoleon III, became the commission to restore the cathedral. And he made his addition and all of that and all. I mean, it was the fire recently, and everybody has been seeking, to rebuild Notre Dame. You see, but in a certain moment, almost they decide to demolish Notre Dame. Indeed, in Liège, where I built a large railway station that people call the cathedral, they demolished the cathedral. It is crazy, the times at the time was, nothing to do with our time. There was a revolutionary times and so on. So you see how novels and architecture can be linked, and also how somebody who writes novels like Victor Hugo can write, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful essays on architecture I have never had the chance to read. And you see, indeed, the fascination of architecture is eventually, this what Henry Moore also said, is bounded of servitude. You have to do toilets. You have to do also doors. You have to think that people enter and go out, emergency exit. You have to think on the disabled. You have to think on so many things, security questions, fire protection is full of codes and so on. So, but once the architecture is there, if you really believe that you can achieve it, and even in the most humble cases, like railway station or bridges, you can achieve something which is visible and create a lot of satisfaction to people, delivers them a sign, is, for example, imagine, without the Brooklyn Bridge, Brooklyn will not be there. They built just the Brooklyn Bridge because they needed the harbor after the Buttermilk Canal. It was just, and then they built this enormous monument to represent New York. And in a way, when the small American flag is put on top of those arcs, represent the whole country. You see that, you think New York and the United States. This is the fourth. You see the Tower Bridge, and you think immediately in London, but you think also in a whole country. And this is the power that this construction have. And it's very important that, like I say, out of the circumstances, to try to catch this force and this symbolic force that the architecture can bring, and through its architectural, sculptural dimension, through his even functional dimension, and more than anything, because they stay in our mind and in our heart as signs and symbols of the cities, of the communities, and this is what I have always believed.
Listen, you wanted to build the tallest building in the world in Chicago, but at the moment there is a project, but it hasn't been achieved. Why?
Eventually, the best projects, they do not get built. You have to be also, you have to go into this world, thinking with a lot of, let's say, a lot of humbleness, We are there for the buildings are there, not for us. You understand? We are there. I mean, sometimes works, sometimes does not work, the circumstances, and also in a changing economy, where, as you see, the cycles of economy, they are always shorter and shorter, an investment, to need maybe eventually 5, 6, 7 years time, to be fulfilled and come to fruition, eventually is no more economic, from the private point of view. And only the public sector can afford a station or a bridge in which they know in the next 20 years we have to work on it. Like, for example, the reconstruction of Ground Zero, where I was involved into building. I think privates will never be able to develop something like that.
We talk about a very, very tall building. For instance, in New York City, as in many other cities, there are now these very tall, thin, small skyscrapers, right? And when you look at them, you feel a bit worried. You say, oh my God, what happens if I lived at the top floor of a building like that, that is exposed to the wind and blah, blah, blah. Are these buildings going to last long? We have in Europe buildings from the Roman time. I mean, the Pantheon in Rome or others like that who last. We talked about the pyramids. We have amazing buildings in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in England, everywhere that lasted for so many centuries. Are these modern buildings going to last? I mean, all these steel and glass and constructions that we see. I mean, I think not only of you, but architects like Frank Gehry or like Zaha Hadid or Tadao Anno. You think this architecture is going to last as long as the ones before?
That's, in my opinion, also a key question. You see, we know from Vitruvio, the Roman tragedies, he has given three qualities an architecture. One is utilitas, utility, beauty, venustas, and then firmitas. Firmitas was the stability, but it was also the durability, how long a building will be there. If we look, you see, the Romans was building almost for us, because and all the generations before us, until the Roman, you see it in the Pantheon. You spoke about the Pantheon, but you see it also, for example, in El Ponte Flaminio in Rome, where the American tanks, in the last World War, traversed the bridge, a bridge who was, there is not a heavier load than a tank, and they went through the bridge without any problem. So they have been building bridge for over 2,000 years. Close to my bridge in Merida, you see the Lusitania Bridge, there is a Roman bridge, still today used. It's incredible. You see, so they went out of the concept that building should survive us and should survive and stay there for generation and generation. This concept is today very different. There are some buildings who was done for a provisional use, like, for example, La Tour Eiffel was done just for the expo at the time in Paris, you see. But you see, they, fortunately, by chance, they preserve it and they keep maintaining it. They finish, repainting it, and then they start it again, and repainting it and start it again. Why? Because the material steel is very sensible, and there is no way, you see, to go around the corrosion except you use special treatments and things like that. Who also, so finally, you see, the fact is that if you go to a client and you ask him, what is the time you need of life for this building, he eventually will tell you is bounded to the mortgage interest until I amortize it, until I get the money who I spend with a certain profit. After that, we could demolish it. So the attitude is completely different, isn't it? You are confronted to a more economicistic approach of project, a more short view understanding of projects, and the dimensioning of those projects in any sense is very much related to certain economical reflection that for the in the Roman time they didn't pay attention to.
Isn't this very frustrating? I mean, I think of buildings like the Castle of Versailles or Castel del Monte in Puglia or other incredible buildings, and they are still there, and we still go there in order to see them. Isn't it frustrating to do something that is conceived to last just l'espace d'un matin, a brief moment?
Certainly it's. And also there is another factor. It is that the authorities, I am speaking about public works in general, eventually also the private, they don't pay attention to maintenance. They think, you are doing something for the next 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, and they will not pay a cent for maintenance. And, out of the nature of the materials and of the economicistic approach to building, maintenance is necessary. And also is not necessary, is more than necessary, it is imperative. Because if you don't do maintenance, you may maybe have damages. And it's all like, you see, it's a system who is based, you see, in a certain asset of stability for the building and a durability, but eventually no more than 1 or 2 generations. And this is the basis in which we work. You see, and what is the problem? The problem is there are 2 problems. First of all, that is necessary to do maintenance. And if you don't do it, you will have damages. And the second, it is that in the reality, the buildings survive us. And they survive us and go for 1, 2, and 3 generations after us and speak about us. And there is no way, to do whatever you do ugly, you see, in a building, it stays there for many generations. Because that the aesthetical sense in building is fundamental. Nevertheless, because we will be judged by the coming generation through the way how we are delivering them a heritage, who are the buildings who in reality, if we want or not, they survive us. Buildings survive us. If they are bad built or in bad quality, survive us in this quality. And if they are ugly, they survive us also as ugly buildings. And you see what it happened if you go to the suburban areas of many European cities. The buildings built during the 50s and 60s, built for pure functional proposal, very, very economic, just to give a roof and to give a toilet and to give a small kitchen to a family or something like that. It was necessary because the people were coming from the country to the cities, in thousands and millions. It was necessary to host them. But today, those areas are in many of our cities very problematic. The people do not want to live there. And the circumstances favorize, you see, an attitude of the young generation who is not at all positive because they have an environment who is also not creative, is not giving them any hope. I mean, it's very important. The question of aesthetic durability and consistent of this, what we do, had to be also rethought, you see, because buildings survive us.
But there are strange phenomena like nowadays, people spend millions to buy, for instance, a house by Jean Prouvé, who was made in order to be, as you said, just functional for simple people in difficult circumstances, right? I mean, a paradox. You said that they have built very simple houses with essential use for people and therefore very economic. And paradox, nowadays, the houses that were built by Jean Prouvé, the French architect, for instance, are sold at auction for an enormous amount of money, and they become collector pieces.
It's very interesting about the world of collectors. Somebody tell me, you see, when you started collecting, eventually you collect works in paper. Then after that, you collect paintings, in canvas. And then you collect also sculptures. And then finally, you collect houses. In between, you collect eventually furniture. It happened that a house in Oak Park in Chicago, I think it was the Robbie house done by Frank Lloyd Wright, was on sale. You see, this was maybe 40 years ago or 30 years ago, the house Robbie was to be sold. And then in Sotheby's, in London, they were selling the dining room of this house. So it was a table and 12 chairs. They pay more for the table and 12 chairs than for the house because the table and 12 chairs, you can transport it and every year will be more expensive because it's a collectible. When the house is open air, is there, you have to maintain it. And then at the other side, you have to pay the taxes of the city and maintain the house, etc., etc. And if being this house by itself as a monument, you have to maintain it also especially well and things like that. So you see, it's very interesting, this mark. But like I say, for me, the sublimation of the collector is the person who collects houses. This is for me the top.
But we are very famous for these public buildings, for the museum in Milwaukee, for the church in New York, for the station at the World Trade Center in New York. That took years to be done, and the Opera House in Tenerife, the City of Arts in Valencia, and so on and so forth. I mean, many, many different kind of public buildings with different use. But what about houses?
That is interesting. It's a very good question, you see. But I come to my first answer. I went into the objects or the type of architectures or the subjects I am doing through competitions. This make the typology of them very limited. To build houses, you need a private to knock in your door and say, oh, I would like to have a house of yours, or I would like to have a condominium. But like I say, when I started, you see, I didn't knew enough people or very few people who will maybe be able to say, do me a house. So finally, I have done apartments. I have done the turning torso in Malmö, and also projected, you see, sometimes you see master plan areas for housing and things like that. But I have to say, you see, at the other side, that one of the most noble things that an architect can do are houses, because it's there where the architecture takes body. You see, I have my coats, and then around me is this space. So I am living in a place, and I have around me the next skin, which are our houses. In our houses we live, in our houses we have our kids, we love, and also we suffer or whatever. There is a very particular, is the next cocoon around the man. Eventually the first reason of architecture, I am sure the first man who thought building something around him was to protect himself from the cold, you see, and from the wind, and try to create a cocoon around him. So the first gesture related to architecture very eventually was to build something similar to a house.
You built a house for yourself, or you never?
I never built a house ex novo. It's like the office where we are. For example, this is our office. I mean, there is an oven here in which is written 1691. So it's very old. And also the house where we live in Zurich also is the house is more than 100 years. And so in New York also is even in a chimney is written Pax Queritur Bello in English, in Latin. You see, it has to be very, very old. So, but I refurbish them with a lot of care, you understand, because mostly those are today, thanks God, houses who are more than 100 years, something like that, they are protected. Thanks God, I say, because many of them has been demolished, and we lost a lot of interesting and fantastic examples of architecture for the epochs, you see. But finally, I think I have to be very honest, I never built a house ex novo, even not for myself. I'm still dreaming to do that.
If we have to express in these 70 years of your life, what is Santiago Calatrava? What are you going to leave? Is there something which is very particular of you? Artists, let's take an example. Giacometti, you know, he makes very thin people. Fontana, he cuts in the painting. You know, each artist has a special, you know, thing. Is there a special style, a special, you know, and therefore people like to recognize and say, this is Calatrava?
I cannot speak about myself in these terms. You see, at the one side, I have been very curious, you see, about many disciplines. So I paint, and I, as you say, I have done also sculptures. I'm an architect and an engineer, and also, I do not know, I have done ceramics, and all of that is a kind of enormous curiosity and the joy to work in new things and to understand that. And particularly also a lot of love for all what comes out of the hands of the man. You know, if it is my hand, the hands of people working with me. So this is the basis. Is the one side curiosity, and the other side also a love for the human product, for the gesture, for this what we can do, and also a big faith in the human being. You understand? Big faith. I think you spoke about Fontana, you spoke about Giacometti. There is in the middle of all the problems that the humanity maybe have, you know, but they are people who believe, who have a very strong belief, and I am to be one of them, isn't it? But at the other side, also you see the job as an architect or as an engineer, it fills you from an enormous humility and humbleness. Because, for example, to build a station in New York, there was necessary hundreds of people. Hundreds. You know, there is also the emotion of all those people who has been working and providing the steel, mounting the steel, welding the steel, painting the steel, and making it possible. So finally, because you need so much people around you to fulfill those things, you feel just one of many. And I tell you that in all sincerity, it fills you of proudness, but also it shows you your limitation, and you are full of gratefulness, to those people, and per extension to the whole world, that you get the opportunity to get involved in doing also an opera in Tenerife. You see, which it is. Imagine Tenerife is in front of the Sahel. They are receiving almost everyday barges full of people who are looking for a better life, and take the traverse of this part of the Atlantic. Is not the richest part of Spain, but they love music. And it is an enormous joy, to work with them, to work with these people and deliver an auditorium in such a remote place, as much as it is also an enormous source of joy, to deliver an station in New York. Is this part of, and finally, I do not think, except this enthusiasm that I conserve after more than 40 years exercising this profession, and is extended to the first day when I entered into Notre-Dame and I saw what architecture can deliver, and what for a great art it is, that maintains me even today.
I will finish this interview telling you that I am grateful to you, because when I travel from Milano to Rome, and in the train you pass by Reggio Emilia, you notice Calatrava's bridge and Calatrava's station, right? And if there were not your station and your bridge, I don't think one would pay any attention to the fact that he is passing through Reggio Emilia.
Yes. You see, it's very interesting. You see, it's really a place in the world, Reggio Emilia. When you think Parma is not far away from there, but in Reggio Emilia, they have also a fantastic opera house, Il Teatro Valle. And then in Parma, you have another one. And then Verdi was born in Busseto, very close to there, and also Pavarotti. So you almost are also Cremona, where the most perfect
violin.
Yes, and so has been fabricated. And even Reggio is a Roman foundation. And it is really, you feel really embedded, you see, in a culture who goes 1,000 years before you get a chance, to do something there. And then the enthusiasm of the people. You see, it was possible to do all of that because the people of Parma, the so-called Confindustria, decide to hire me to do the project so that the railways, by passing through and having to build those bridges and this station, they deliver something of this, what they thought of quality. And I spoke before about the factor of the people who works on the site. And I feel one of them, you see. But at the other side, I am now speaking about the people who promote a building. Very important. The client is capital for the quality of a building. I arrived to the conclusion that there is not a good building without a good client. Even a medium architect, can do a good building if a good client is there. But there is not good building without a good client. And Reggio Emilia is a good proof of it.
Thank you, Santiago. It was very interesting to hear your opinion and your facts.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Alain Elkann interviews.